Robert E. Lee, Gallant Christian Soldier, by Lee Roddy. Chapter 12, Appomattox Farewell. April, traditional time for beginning wars and launching new campaigns, saw Grant's massive assembly of blue-coated soldiers ready to take the field. Lee's hungry and weary men, greatly outnumbered, reeled back under Federal attacks. Lee sent word to Davis and the Secretary of War, urging all preparations be made for leaving Richmond. The cabinet fled that night by train, but it was too late. Union troops were flooding over everything in Virginia and the rest of the Confederacy. The president and other officials became prisoners. Lee's son, Custis, along with other high-ranking Confederate officers, were taken by the massive hordes of onrushing Federals. The news reached Lee of the events. He claimed, "Has the army been dissolved?" As the first week of April ended, Grant sent 3 of his best officers to personally hand Lee a note. Lee read it. Further resistance was hopeless. Surrender? Lee handed the note to Longstreet. He answered, "Not yet." But Lee was also a realist. He did what had to be done. What surrender terms did Grant propose? What was left of the Army of Northern Virginia had been moving west, away from Richmond and Petersburg. The Union troops had taken the capital after it was abandoned. The siege at Petersburg had been successful for Grant. Union soldiers were close behind the ragged Confederates. Rebel supplies were captured, and slowly escape routes were being shut by Grant's massive army. He was closing in on Lee. On Saturday night, April 8th, as Lee neared Appomattox Courthouse, Grant's latest letter came to him. Grant had been commander of the entire Confederate force for only 2 months and 2 days. He replied to Grant, saying, "I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask you the terms of your proposition." Lee's words were brave. "I do not think that emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army, but as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desire to know whether these proposals will lead to that." Lee explained he could not meet with Grant with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command, and to tend to the restoration of peace, I shall be pleased to meet you at 10 a.m. tomorrow. As Lee had said earlier, we have appealed to the God of battles, and he has decided against us. Lee prepared for meeting with Grant. Other notes passed back and forth between the 2 men before final arrangements were made. The meeting place was a 2-story house with chimneys at either end and wide front steps leading up to the first floor's long porch. A similar porch with white, open woodwork balcony graced the second story. It was loaned by Wilmer McLean. He had moved from Manassas to escape the fighting. Now the war had caught up with him again. The McLean home was a part of a little-known village called Appomattox Courthouse. There was a tavern, a jail, a courthouse, and a few homes. But the war was not over, and fighting was still going on as Lee continued to exchange notes with Grant. Gordon's final effort to break out of the Federal lines had been made that very weekend. It was short-lived. The enormous Union forces swept in upon Gordon. Soon word had come to Lee. "I have fought my troops to a frazzle," Gordon reported, "and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet." But Longstreet could not come. Then Lee said the words which signaled the end of the conflict. "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." An officer asked, "What will history say of the surrender of this army in the field?" Lee figured, "They will say hard things of us. They will not understand how we were overwhelmed by numbers." Then Lee explained, "But that is not the question, Colonel. The question is it right to surrender this army? If it is right, then I will take all the responsibility. 3 generals came with a final proposal that they would urge their men to take to the woods and bushes, where they would be as hard to catch as rabbits and partridges. In effect, this was a proposal for guerrilla warfare. Lee wisely replied, "We must consider its effect on the country as a whole. If I took your advice, the men would be without rations and under no control of officers. They would be compelled to rob and steal in order to live. They would become mere bands of marauders, and the enemy's cavalry would pursue them and overrun many wide sections they may never have occasion to visit. We would bring on a state of affairs it would take the country years to recover from." General E.P. Alexander, who had first proposed the idea, later wrote, "He, Lee, had answered my suggestion from a plane so far above it that I was ashamed of having made it." Now all that was past. There was still talk of joining up with Johnston's troops, but it looked hopeless. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry and Gordon's foot soldiers were engulfed by the overwhelming masses of Union troops west of Appomattox. Behind them, more blue-coated Federals could be seen moving up. Lee had been up since 3 a.m., that Palm Sunday, April 9th, 1865. Carefully he dressed in his finest and last gray uniform. He pulled a silk sash above his middle, buckled in a ceremonial sword, and mounted Traveler. With Sergeant G.W. Tucker carrying a white flag and Colonel Charles Marshall riding along as an aide, Lee touched his heels to his big gray horse. Traveler picked his way through fog covering the field at Appomattox Courthouse. In the dawn's pale light, Lee saw an apple tree. The flowering tree was filled with the life of springtime. Lee pulled Traveler up and rested under the tree. White blossoms occasionally floated to the ground while Lee waited for word from Grant. There was time to think. Lee stayed under the apple tree, perhaps thinking of his oldest son, Custis, who had recently been taken prisoner. The war had cost Lee so heavily that a lesser man might have buckled under the load, but he had kept going, sustained by his unswerving belief in the God he served. Finally, the general stirred as a courier from Grant advanced through the morning sun. "General Grant is coming, sir." Lee nodded. He touched his heels to the big gray horse. In the distance, firing was still flaring up in sporadic bursts as Lee moved toward the McLean house. Sergeant Tucker's flag of truce waved gently as he followed Lee's lead. Colonel Marshall rode ahead beside McLean to his home. Some of Lee's men, not rolled up in the blanket of massive Federal forces sweeping everything before them, cheered their general as he passed. Then, slowly, as the full meaning of the white handkerchief on a stick in Tucker's hands struck them, the cheers died. After some delays at Federal outposts, Lee and his small party moved up the hill towards Appomattox Courthouse. McLean led the way up the front wide steps of his home. Then Lee waited. It was a long wait. Well, after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, before Grant reined up outside. He had not slept. A sick headache had caused him to seek relief by soaking his feet in hot water and putting mustard plasters on the back of his neck and against his wrists. At 4 a.m., still suffering from the headache, he had taken to the road. It had taken a courier some time to find him. He dismounted in front of McLean's steps. Sheridan and other officers in blue tunics swung down from their saddles and trailed Grant into the room where Lee waited. Grant looked as though he had spent a bad night. His face showed strain, and his clothes were soiled and dusty. Except for shoulder straps, his uniform gave no indication of rank. At 5 feet 8 inches, he had to look up to Lee, who stood just under 6 feet. Grant was 16 years younger than Lee. The two men varied in other ways. Grant's full beard was dark. He was a cigar-smoking, hard-drinking man. Lee's exact opposite. Marshall, Lee's aide, observed. General Lee was standing at the end of the room opposite the door when General Grant walked in. Grant, his boots badly mud-splattered, pulled off his dark yellow gloves, and tossed his stiff-brimmed hat on the table. Grant walked across the room to Lee. "I met you once before, General Lee," the Union commander said, "in Mexico when you came over from Scott's headquarters to visit Garland's brigade." Lee, immaculate in his uniform, shook hands as Grant continued. "I have always remembered your appearance, and I think I'd recognize you anywhere," Grant said in the clipped, sharp tones of his northern accent. The Confederate commander was honest. "Yes, I know I met you then, and I have often tried to recollect how you looked, but I have never been able to recall a single feature," Lee said softly, slurring his words together in Southern fashion. There was an awkward silence as the room full of blue-clad officers and the two gray uniformed Lee aides watched. The general spoke of Mexico and the weather. Lee finally drew Grant's attention to the matter at hand. "I suppose, General Grant, that the object of our meeting is fully understood." Grant replied that the surrender terms were about as stated in his letter of the day before. That is, the officers and men surrendered to be paroled and disqualified from taking up arms again until properly exchanged, and all arms, ammunition, and supplies to be delivered up as captured property. Lee answered, "Those are the conditions I would expected would be proposed." The two generals talked a little more. Then Grant called for Ely Parker, chief of the Six Nations, to bring writing materials. The full-blooded Indian carried a small table to the Union general. Grant sat down, lit his pipe, and puffed away as he thought a moment, then began to write. When the rough draft was handed to Lee, he put on his glasses and read slowly and carefully. He suggested a couple of minor changes. A word was missing. Lee asked about it. Grant replied he had intended to put in the word exchange, referring to prisoners. "With your permission," Lee said, "I will mark where it should be inserted." Grant nodded. "Certainly." Lee had no pencil. A Union colonel handed over his. Lee thanked him, made the insertion, and continued reading. Lee touched his spectacles thoughtfully. The next condition proposed by Grant directly affected the dress sword Lee had worn to the meeting. The pact read, "This will not embrace the sight of arms of the officers or their private horses or baggage." Lee had deliberately written the surrender terms so that Lee would not have to suffer the embarrassment of having to hand over his sword. It was improper, under Grant's own terms, for Grant to ask for Lee's sword. Lee continued reading the surrender document. "Each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authorities, so as long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General."